He grew up in a neighborhood where the streets carried stories of struggle more than dreams. Houses leaned on each other for support, much like the families within them, but the support was fragile. His own home was small, a cramped apartment with walls that had long forgotten the meaning of paint, and a ceiling that leaked whenever the rain stormed hard enough. Nights were long and restless, filled with the sounds of arguments about bills that never seemed to end, of dreams deferred and promises broken. Money was always short, and opportunities were even shorter. From a young age, he learned the meaning of nothing not as an abstract idea but as a persistent, gnawing feeling. It was the feeling of being invisible, of watching life happen to others while he remained a spectator in his own story. Jakul offered little solace. Teachers rarely believed in him, classmates teased him for what they perceived as weaknesses, and the education system itself seemed indifferent. Failure became familiar, almost comforting, because it matched the expectations of everyone around him. He told himself he was being realistic, but what he called realism was simply fear wrapped in the guise of logic. Each rejection, be it a poor grade, a missed opportunity, or a dream he wasn't allowed to chase, quietly reinforced the idea that he wasn't meant for more. He began to internalize limitations that weren't truly his own, creating invisible barriers in his mind, walls even higher than the ones that surrounded his home. Despite the external challenges, the most difficult battles were inside him. He carried shame for his family's struggles, frustration for his own perceived failures, and a quiet longing for something he didn't even have the words to name. He envied those who seemed to glide through life effortlessly, never realizing that their ease often came after invisible hardships of their own. But envy, he soon realized, was a dangerous companion. It could either fuel ambition or crush hope. And for years, it crushed him. He told himself the story of his insignificance so many times that he began to believe it. Then one evening, after another day of grueling, thankless work at a local store, he found himself sitting alone on the cracked steps outside his building. The streetlights flickered, the night carried a sharp chill, and the distant hum of the city felt like a reminder of all the life he wasn't living. He thought about the cycles he had inherited, the cycles of struggle, of waiting, of staying small. He realized with sudden clarity that he had been waiting for someone else to save him, someone else to recognize his worth, someone else to give him permission to exist fully. And no one was coming. That night, the quiet struck him with the force of a revelation. If he stayed the same, if he continued to surrender to the world's low expectations, he would live a life dictated by circumstances instead of choice. The thought was uncomfortable, almost terrifying, because change is rarely gentle. It demands courage, discipline, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. But in that moment, he felt something else, something raw and dangerous. The possibility that he could choose differently. He could decide not to accept nothing as a permanent state. He could refuse to let the life he was born into define the life he would lead. That night, no miracle descended, no opportunity magically appeared, but the seed of transformation was planted. He didn't feel powerful yet, not in any conventional sense. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and untested, but he felt awake in a way he hadn't before. The first step toward change, he learned, isn't external. It is the decision to stop surrendering to circumstance and to start taking ownership of your mindset. That awakening, he would later realize, was far more valuable than any external reward, because it marked the moment he began to recognize his own agency. The journey from nothing to something begins not with wealth, connections, or recognition. It begins with the refusal to accept the version of yourself that the world assumes you will be. And for the first time, he refused. Change didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the first light of dawn slowly spilling over a dark horizon. He began to wake up earlier than he ever had before, not because he was motivated in the traditional sense, but because he had made a decision. Excuses were no longer acceptable. He noticed how much time he had wasted, how many opportunities he had allowed to pass by simply because he lacked the courage to act. Now, even small actions felt revolutionary: reading a book, writing down goals, learning a new skill. Each tiny effort was a defiance against the version of himself that had once believed nothing could change. He discovered the power of knowledge, and with it, the dangerous thrill of possibility. He read about people who had built empires from scratch, who had endured pain, rejection, and poverty, yet had risen anyway. Their stories were not sugar-coated. They were raw, filled with moments of despair, sleepless nights, and sacrifices most people never witness. At first, their accomplishments felt intimidating, almost unattainable. But slowly, their persistence inspired him. He realized he didn't need to become someone else. He needed to become a better version of himself, incrementally, every single day. Failure still visited him often. Each setback was a test, a harsh teacher that refused to offer comfort. But now, failure no longer crushed him. It became data, feedback, and occasionally, a challenge to be outsmarted. He began to separate his identity from his outcomes, understanding that failing at a task did not mean he was a failure. This shift was subtle but monumental. Pain no longer signified the end of the road. It became fuel to propel him forward. Rejection no longer closed doors. It revealed where he had room to grow. He learned to sit with discomfort, to welcome uncertainty, and to embrace struggle as an inevitable companion on the path to success. Discipline became his silent ally. It was not glamorous, nor did it bring immediate gratification. The early mornings, the long nights, the repeated failures, they demanded persistence, and he delivered. Every day he held himself accountable, not to anyone else, but to the vision he was building for himself. Consistency became his weapon against doubt, against fear, against the old voice that whispered, "You're not enough." It was not about being perfect. It was about showing up, again and again, even when the world didn't notice. People around him began to notice subtle changes, not wealth or status, but presence. His confidence was no longer performative. It was quiet, earned, and undeniable. He no longer sought validation from others because he had begun validating himself. His thoughts became sharper, his decisions clearer, and his mindset more resilient. The old version of himself, who had accepted nothing as a permanent state, seemed like a stranger from a distant past. He had become someone who could endure, adapt, and rise, even when circumstances were harsh. He learned a truth that would define the rest of his journey. Motivation is fleeting, but discipline and identity are permanent. He wasn't chasing fleeting inspiration anymore. He was constructing a self-image of resilience, one that could withstand the inevitable storms of life. Each challenge became an opportunity to reinforce this identity, each struggle a reminder that he was capable of more than he had once imagined. By the end of this stage, he was no longer the same person who had once sat on cracked steps, overwhelmed by hopelessness. He was someone quietly relentless, someone building an unstoppable inner foundation. Success, he realized, was no longer about luck or opportunity. It was about mindset, consistency, and the unwavering refusal to let past failures dictate future possibilities. The journey was far from over, but the transformation was real. He had begun to evolve from surviving life to shaping it, from being reactive to being proactive, from being uncertain to being unshakably committed to his own growth. By the time he reached this stage of his life, the world he once feared had become a playground for his resilience. The man who had grown up in cramped apartments, haunted by the feeling of nothing, had transformed into someone unrecognizable even to himself. But the change wasn't in wealth, possessions, or recognition. It was internal, unshakable, and profound. He had built a life not defined by circumstances, but by the choices he made, the habits he cultivated, and the mindset he refused to surrender. The person he had once been, the one who doubted, who waited for permission, who believed support unity was something reserved for others, had been left behind, replaced by someone who understood the meaning of unstoppable. Challenges still existed, and they never truly disappeared. Life continued to test him, throwing obstacles in ways both predictable and unexpected. But the difference now was that he no longer feared them. He had learned to see problems as puzzles, setbacks as lessons, and criticism as guidance. Every difficulty was an invitation to practice resilience, patience, and creativity. Where others saw dead ends, he saw detours, and where others saw failure, he saw feedback. He had cultivated a mindset that refused to bow to adversity, a mindset forged in the fires of struggle and tempered by years of disciplined growth. He realized that being unstoppable did not mean being invincible. Pain could still pierce him, doubt could still whisper, and circumstances could still threaten his progress. But unstoppable meant something deeper. It meant refusing to quit, no matter how steep the climb. It meant trusting himself even when the world questioned him. It meant moving forward, step by step, when the path was uncertain and the nights were long. He had become relentless, not in arrogance, but but in a quiet, unshakable faith in his own abilities. Looking back, he understood that the nothing of his youth had been his greatest teacher. It had taught him hunger, the relentless desire to rise above circumstance. It had taught him humility, the understanding that no achievement is guaranteed and no one owes you success. And it had taught him gratitude, the rare ability to celebrate each victory, no matter how small, because he knew what it felt like to have nothing. The absence of privilege had forced him to cultivate strength, resourcefulness, and vision. His beginnings had been humble, but they had equipped him with lessons that wealth or comfort could never provide. The external markers of success, career achievements, recognition, or financial security were meaningful, but he understood that the true victory was internal. He had become a man who no longer waited for opportunity to knock. He created it. He had become a man whose confidence was rooted not in comparison, but in self-mastery. He had become someone who moved through life with intention, focus, and the quiet certainty that he could overcome whatever came next. His identity had been rebuilt, brick by brick, from the foundations of resilience, discipline, and courage. Even now, he was not complacent. Growth is a continuum, and he had learned that stagnation is the true enemy. Each day brought new challenges, new opportunities to test his limits, and new lessons to refine his character. But he approached each day differently than before, with clarity, focus, and a deep awareness of his own power. He knew that life would never stop testing him, but he was no longer afraid of tests. He welcomed them as the instruments of his continued transformation. From nothing, he had built discipline. From discipline, he had built confidence. From confidence, he had built momentum. And from momentum, he had built a life that no longer asked for permission, validation, or approval. He understood, finally, that the journey from nothing to unstoppable is not a straight path, but a continuous evolution of mindset and self-belief. He had learned the ultimate lesson. It is not where you start that determines your destiny, but the unwavering refusal to stop, the courage to keep moving, and the belief that nothing can hold back a determined spirit. He had become unstoppable not because life was easy, but because he had mastered himself. And that mastery, he knew, was the greatest power any human could ever possess.